Imagine waking up at 71 years old in a house so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat. Imagine opening a refrigerator that has less food in it every single month, not because you're eating less, but because everything costs more and your check stays exactly the same. Imagine sitting at a kitchen table with a stack of bills in front of you, doing the math over and over, hoping that somehow the numbers will change if you just add them up one more time. That was my life. My name is Robert Harrison. Everybody calls me Bob. And for 39 years, I was a mail carrier for the United States Postal Service in Cleveland, Ohio. I walked the same streets for decades. I watched kids grow up, get married, have kids of their own, and I delivered every birthday card and Christmas package along the way. I thought that after all those years of service, retirement would be my reward. Instead, it became my quiet punishment. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and leave a comment telling us which country you're watching this video from. I need to take you back to the beginning, because you won't understand why the Philippines saved my life unless you understand what my life in America had become. And I want to tell it slowly, the way it actually happened, not the shortened version. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood on the east side of Cleveland, in a narrow two-story house with aluminum siding that my father repainted every 10 years whether it needed it or not. My father worked in a steel plant for 31 years, coming home every evening with the same tired walk, the same smell of metal and sweat on his clothes. My mother cleaned houses for extra money on the side, 3 days a week, taking 2 buses to get to the wealthier neighborhoods on the west side. Neither of them ever complained, at least not in front of me. That silence taught me something I carried my whole life, that a man's job was to show up, to work, and to keep his troubles to himself. I was an only child, which in that neighborhood, in that era, was almost unusual. Most families had 4 or 5 kids crammed into houses like ours. I think my parents wanted more children but couldn't afford it, though nobody ever said that out loud either. What I remember most from my childhood is the sound of the 6 a.m. alarm clock through the thin wall between my room and theirs, and my father's slow, heavy steps down the stairs before the sun came up. When I turned 20, right after 2 years at a community college studying accounting that I never finished, I took the civil service exam for the Postal Service. I passed it on my first try, something my father was quietly proud of, though he'd never have said so directly. Within a few months, I was delivering mail on a route in the Collinwood neighborhood, walking 8, sometimes 10 miles a day, rain or shine, snow or heat. I never imagined I'd still be doing that same job, more or less, 39 years later. But somewhere along the way, being the mailman became my whole identity. People on my route didn't know my last name most of the time. I was just Bob the mailman, the guy who knew everyone's dog by name, who noticed when an elderly resident hadn't collected their mail in 3 days and would knock on the door just to check they were okay. I want you to understand that this job wasn't just a paycheck to me. It was a role in a community. It gave me purpose in a quiet, unglamorous way that most people never notice from the outside. I met my wife, Carol, on that very route, in my 2nd year on the job. She lived in a small brick house with a wraparound porch on Elmwood Avenue, and every day around the same time, she'd be out watering her flowers, geraniums mostly, in wooden boxes along the porch railing. For months, our conversation never went past "good morning" and a nod. Then one day, in a moment of courage I still don't fully understand, I asked her if she'd like to get a cup of coffee sometime. She said yes. 6 months later, we were married in a small ceremony at St. Jerome's, with maybe 40 guests, a borrowed suit, and a cake her aunt baked. Carol and I built something modest but full over the following decades. We bought a small 3-bedroom house not far from where I grew up. Nothing fancy, but ours. We had 2 children, Michael first, then Diane 3 years later. I remember Michael's birth vividly, that specific kind of fear and joy that hits a young father at 2 in the morning in a hospital waiting room. Diane came a few years later, quieter than her brother from the very start, watchful, thoughtful, the kind of child who noticed everything. Every summer, without fail, we took the kids to Cedar Point, the amusement park a couple hours from Cleveland. It became a tradition, the same rickety roller coasters, the same overpriced hot dogs, The same sunburns by the end of the day. We went to church most Sundays at St. Jerome's, the same parish where we married. We saved a little bit of money every month into a retirement account through the postal service, because that's what you were supposed to do. Work hard, live modestly, save what you can, and when you're old, you'll finally get to rest. That was the deal. Nobody ever told me the deal could quietly change on you after decades of holding up your end of it. For a while, it genuinely seemed like the promise might come true. I retired at 62 with a modest pension and Social Security. Carol and I started talking, almost shyly, about the things we'd put off for 40 years. Maybe a cruise to Alaska. Maybe finally visiting the kids more, since Michael had settled 2 hours away in Columbus, and Diane had moved even further, down to Charlotte, North Carolina, chasing a job in logistics management. We had, for the first time in our married life, actual free time and the beginning of a plan for what to do with it. Then, 4 years ago, everything changed. Carol started having stomach pain she assumed was nothing, indigestion, stress, age. By the time the doctors found the pancreatic cancer, it had already progressed too far for the kind of treatment that saves people. 6 months after her diagnosis, she was gone. I won't pretend that grief doesn't fundamentally change a house, because it does, in ways I don't think anyone can explain to you unless they've lived through it. The silence Carol left behind wasn't simply an absence of sound. It was an absence of purpose, an absence of a reason to get up in the morning beyond the basic biological necessity of it. I woke every day in a bed that suddenly felt enormous, made coffee for one person instead of two out of 41 years of habit, and sat in a living room that used to be filled with her laughter, her terrible taste in daytime television, her voice calling out from the kitchen asking if I wanted tea. My daughter Diane called to check on me constantly in those first months, and I told her I was fine, because what else do you say? That I was sitting in my recliner most days, sometimes for 6 or 7 hours at a stretch, watching television I didn't even care about, because I genuinely didn't know what else to do with the hours in front of me. Grief doesn't just take away the person you loved. It takes away the architecture of your entire day, the small rituals that gave your life its shape. Grief alone was hard enough to survive. But what came in the 2 years after Carol passed made an already difficult situation almost unbearable. My property taxes went up as Cleveland reassessed home values in my neighborhood. My health insurance premiums crept upward every single year, the way they always seem to. The cost of my blood pressure medication increased, then increased again. Groceries, which Carol used to manage so carefully, suddenly felt like an entirely different, more frightening budget category once I was the one doing the shopping and the math. Everything I needed simply to continue existing kept climbing, month after month, while my fixed income from Social Security and my modest USPS pension stayed exactly where it had been for years. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, the very same table where Carol and I used to eat breakfast together every morning for over 4 decades, going through my bank statement line by line, the way I did every single month by then. Social Security check, same amount as last year, with maybe a tiny cost of living increase that never seemed to match reality. Pension, exactly the same. Grocery bill, up roughly 11% from the year before. Prescription copay, up almost 20%. Heating bill during a Cleveland winter, up so much that I started keeping the thermostat set at 62 degrees during the day, just so the numbers would work out by the end of the month, wearing an extra sweater inside my own home like some kind of penance. I want to be honest with you because I believe a great many people watching this know exactly the feeling I'm describing. There is a very specific kind of humiliation in being 71 years old, having worked diligently and honestly for nearly 4 decades, having done every single thing you were told to do by the system, and still lying awake at 3 in the morning doing arithmetic in your head, wondering whether you'll be able to afford your heart medication next month. Nobody warns you about that particular indignity. Nobody sits you down at 25 years old and tells you that the so-called golden years might actually mean choosing between a prescription refill and keeping your electric bill current. My son Michael, 2 hours away in Columbus, had his own mortgage, his own 2 kids approaching college age, his own financial pressures that he rarely discussed with me, but that I could sense in the tightness of his voice whenever money came up. My daughter Diane, even further away in Charlotte, was working long hours in a logistics management career that left her exhausted most evenings. They loved me. I never once doubted that, not for a single moment throughout any of this. But they had their own mortgages, their own children's futures to secure, their own struggles that were entirely separate from mine, even as they orbited around the same worry. When I mentioned my money troubles to Diane once, carefully, almost apologetically, over the phone, she paused and then said, gently but firmly, "Dad, maybe you should think about assisted living. At least you'd have people around you, and it might actually be more affordable than the house." She meant well. I know she meant well. But something in me went cold when she said those words, something I couldn't fully name at the time. That's when I began to understand something quietly devastating. My own children, without any cruelty or bad intention whatsoever, had started to see me not as their father, the man who used to carry them on his shoulders at Cedar Point, who taught Michael to ride a bike in the driveway, who sat up all night with Diane when she had the flu in third grade, but as a logistical problem that needed a solution. Somewhere to place me so that I wouldn't become a burden on their already stretched lives. I want to be extremely clear about something. Nobody in my family did anything wrong here. Diane wasn't trying to hurt me, and neither was Michael in his own quieter way of gently suggesting I simplify things. But there is a particular, very lonely realization in understanding that the people who love you most in this world have started making contingency plans for your decline, instead of asking you what you actually want out of whatever years remain. Nobody sat me down and asked what would make me happy anymore. They asked what would keep me safe, what would keep me manageable, what would keep me from becoming a complication in their calendars. And somewhere deep down, in a part of myself I hadn't fully examined until much later, I understood that safety and actually living are not always the same thing at all. Here is where the story takes its first real turn, and I think about this moment often, because it's strange how the biggest changes in a life can start from something as small as a notification on a phone screen. Before I was ever a mail carrier, I served 4 years in the United States Navy, right out of high school. One of my closest friends from that time was a man named Gary Whitfield, a fellow sailor from Tucson, Arizona, who I hadn't spoken to in any real way for almost 30 years. We lost touch for decades in that way people naturally do. A Christmas card here, an occasional phone call there during some milestone, and then long stretches of nothing at all, the way life just absorbs people into its own current. About 8 months before everything changed, Gary found me on Facebook, of all things, and sent a friend request with a short message. "Bob Harrison? Is this the same Bob from the USS Constellation?" We started messaging back and forth almost every day after that, catching up on nearly 40 years of separate lives. And that's when I learned that Gary had been living in Cebu, in the Philippines, for the past 6 years. His wife, Linda, had passed away around roughly the same time as Carol, and instead of staying in his empty house in Arizona surrounded by the same silence I knew all too well, Gary made a decision that I honestly thought sounded a little bit crazy when he first described it. He sold nearly everything he owned and moved to Southeast Asia, a part of the world he'd apparently only visited once before, decades earlier, on a brief Navy port call. He started sending me photographs, unprompted, almost like he sensed something was wrong in my life just from the tone of my messages. Not resort brochures, not the kind of staged tourist nonsense you see in travel advertisements. Real, ordinary photos of his actual daily life. A photo of him having breakfast on a small concrete terrace overlooking the water, mango slices, and a cup of local coffee on a plastic table in front of him. A photo of him laughing with a group of local friends at what looked like an outdoor neighborhood gathering, string lights overhead, plastic chairs arranged in a loose circle. A photo of a modest but genuinely lovely apartment with tall windows and a ceiling fan, clearly costing him a fraction of what my heating bill alone cost me every single Cleveland winter. "Bob," he wrote to me one night out of nowhere, "I know this probably sounds strange, but I want you to know something. You can still actually live. I know that sounds like nothing much, but after Linda passed, I genuinely didn't think I'd feel like a real person again. Out here, somehow, I do. I remember reading that message 3 or 4 times in a row, sitting in my recliner with the television murmuring in the background, completely forgotten. You can still actually live. Such a simple sentence, almost embarrassingly plain, but it hit something inside me that I hadn't touched or acknowledged in years. Because if I was being honest with myself, sitting there in that quiet house, I hadn't been living. I had been existing, waiting, slowly, quietly managing my own decline instead of experiencing whatever days I had left. I asked him more questions over the following weeks, tentatively at first, then with growing curiosity. How much does an apartment actually cost there? What about healthcare, at our age, with the medications we both need? Is it safe for someone my age? Do people genuinely accept foreigners, especially older ones who don't speak the language? He answered every single question patiently, sometimes with hard numbers, sometimes with stories about his neighbors, sometimes just with more photographs that said more than any explanation could. He told me his total monthly cost of living, rent, food, a part-time helper who came twice a week to clean and help around the house, occasional dinners out with friends, added up to less than half of what I was struggling to survive on in Cleveland every month. And more importantly than any of the numbers, he told me that for the first time since Linda died, he woke up most mornings genuinely excited about the day ahead of him, rather than simply enduring it. I didn't decide right away, and I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. This wasn't some impulsive fantasy dreamed up over a lonely weekend. For almost 2 months, I researched everything I could possibly find about retiring in the Philippines, staying up far later than I should have most nights, my reading glasses perched on my nose, a legal pad full of notes beside my laptop. I looked into the Special Resident Retirees Visa program in detail, printing out the requirements and reading them over multiple times. I read expat forums until 2 in the morning some nights, absorbing stories from other Americans, mostly retirees, who had made similar moves, some who loved it, a few who had gone back home disappointed, and I made sure to read the disappointed ones just as carefully as the happy ones, because I wanted the whole truth, not just the version that would make me feel good about a decision I hadn't made yet. I calculated, recalculated, and calculated again exactly what my Social Security and USPS pension would actually be worth in Philippine pesos, factoring in exchange rate fluctuations, factoring in worst-case scenarios, factoring in the cost of flights home in case of an emergency. And here is the thing that genuinely shocked me the most during all of this research. The exact same amount of money that barely kept me afloat in Cleveland, money that had me literally choosing between medication and heat some months, would allow me to live comfortably, even generously, in Cebu. Not just comfortably. Well, I could afford a nice, modern apartment with air conditioning. I could afford good, fresh food every single day instead of carefully rationed groceries. I could even afford, for the first time in years, the real possibility of hiring some part-time help if my health ever required it later on, without that expense draining every last dollar I had left. But it wasn't only about the money, and I want to stress that, because I know some people watching this will assume this is purely a financial story. It was also about something Gary said to me on a long phone call one evening, a call that went on for almost 2 hours, longer than any conversation we'd had since our Navy days. He said, "Bob, over here, nobody looks at you like you're old and finished. People are warm. People are curious about you, about where you came from, about your life. You're not invisible. Invisible." That single word stayed lodged in me for days afterward, because that's precisely what I had started to feel like in America, in ways I hadn't fully admitted to myself until I heard someone else name it out loud. Invisible in my own neighborhood, where the young families moving in didn't know or particularly care about the old mailman 2 doors down. Invisible to my own children's busy, overloaded lives, not out of any cruelty on their part, just out of the exhausting, relentless math of modern American life. Invisible in a broader culture that seemed to have quietly decided that once you pass a certain age, Your story is basically over, and all that's left is managing the ending as quietly, cheaply, and efficiently as possible. I made my final decision on a Tuesday morning in November. I remember the specific day clearly because it was raining. That particular cold, gray Cleveland rain that seems to soak straight through your coat and into your bones, no matter how many layers you're wearing. I was sitting in my recliner, the same recliner I'd been sitting in for nearly 2 years since Carol passed, staring at nothing in particular on the muted television screen. And I said out loud, to a completely empty room, "I'm not going to die in this chair." Saying it out loud into that silence made it feel real in a way that simply thinking it hadn't. I called my son Michael first, my hands actually shaking slightly as I dialed. He was quiet for a long time on the phone after I explained what I was considering, long enough that I asked if he was still there. Then he finally said, "Dad, are you sure? That's so far away. What if something happens to you and we can't get there fast enough?" I told him I understood his concern completely, that it was a fair and loving concern, but that I needed him to understand something too. I wasn't running away from my family. I was running toward whatever real chapters of my life I still had left to write. I told him I loved him and his sister more than anything in this world, but that loving them didn't mean I had to disappear quietly into a recliner, waiting for an ending, just to make my presence easier for everyone else to manage. Diane took the news harder at first, which honestly didn't surprise me, given how the assisted living conversation had gone before. She worried, quite reasonably, about my health so far from familiar hospitals. She worried about scams targeting older Americans abroad, having read one too many news stories on the subject. She worried, understandably, about the sheer distance between us, about time zones, about emergencies. I understood every single one of her fears, because I had privately carried the exact same fears myself during those 2 months of research. But eventually, I told her something I had come to believe with total conviction. "Diane, I have already lived the safe life. I raised you and your brother. I served my community for almost 40 years walking those same streets. I loved your mother faithfully until her very last breath. I have earned the right to choose what my last chapter looks like, even if that choice frightens you a little." 6 months after that phone call, my house on the same street I'd lived on for over 3 decades was sold to a young couple expecting their first child, which felt strangely fitting somehow. Most of my furniture was given away to neighbors or sold at a modest estate sale, including, most painfully of all, the kitchen table where Carol and I had eaten breakfast together for over 40 years, the table where I'd later done all that grim monthly arithmetic alone. I kept only what fit into 2 suitcases and a handful of boxes I shipped ahead of me. And on a cold, unremarkable morning in April, I boarded a plane out of Cleveland Hopkins Airport, connected through Los Angeles, and after nearly 20 exhausting hours of total travel time, I landed in Cebu, Philippines, a place I had never once set foot in before that exact moment. Nothing on earth prepares you for the heat when you first step off that plane. It hits you like a warm, wet wall, thick and humid in a way that felt completely foreign to a man who had just spent 39 winters walking mail routes through Cleveland snow. Gary was waiting for me right there at the arrivals gate, looking considerably older than I remembered him from our Navy days decades earlier, silver-haired and slightly heavier, but with a look in his eyes I honestly hadn't seen on anyone in years. A kind of genuine, uncomplicated happiness. "Welcome home, Bob," he said, and hugged me tightly right there at the gate, in front of dozens of strangers, neither of us caring in the slightest. The drive from the airport to the neighborhood where I'd be renting my first small apartment was overwhelming in every possible sense. Motorbikes weaving impossibly close between cars, roadside vendors selling fruit I didn't even recognize by sight or name, the sounds of Cebuano, Tagalog, and English blending together in a rhythm my ears weren't used to. The smell of grilled food drifting from small roadside stalls mixing with exhaust fumes and salt air from the nearby coast. I remember thinking, with a genuine flicker of panic, what exactly have I done? That first week was profoundly disorienting. I didn't yet understand the currency conversions in my head, so every single purchase, however small, felt like an anxious math problem. I got lost twice just trying to find a pharmacy that was, in reality, only a 10-minute walk from my apartment. I didn't know even the most basic Cebuano greetings, so I felt oddly like a child again, unable to communicate the simplest everyday needs. There was one particular night, about 5 days into this new life, where I sat completely alone in my new apartment, jet-lagged and overwhelmed and genuinely frightened, questioning whether I had just made the single worst mistake of my entire life. But something happened the very next morning that I will never forget as long as I live. I walked down to a small local restaurant near my apartment, the kind of unpretentious place with plastic chairs and a handwritten menu taped to the wall, and I fumbled my way awkwardly through ordering breakfast, pointing more than speaking. The woman running the place, an older lady named Nana, laughed kindly, not unkindly, at my clumsy attempt to pronounce the name of the dish, then patiently, without any trace of impatience, taught me the correct way to say it, having me repeat it back to her twice until I got it right. She didn't roll her eyes at the slow, confused foreigner in front of her. She didn't treat me like an inconvenience taking up space during her busy morning rush. She treated me, from that very first fumbling interaction, like a guest worth investing her time and patience in. I sat there eating that simple breakfast, rice, a fried egg, a piece of grilled fish, overlooking a small side street full of ordinary morning activity, motorbikes and bicycles and children walking to school in matching uniforms, and for the first time in longer than I could honestly remember, I felt something unfamiliar stirring in my chest. Not happiness exactly, not yet, not that quickly, but curiosity, possibility, a quiet, tentative sense that maybe my story wasn't finished after all, that there might still be pages left to write that I hadn't anticipated. Adjusting to life in the Philippines happened through a series of small, unglamorous steps, not through one single dramatic transformation, and I want to share some of those steps as honestly as I can, because I think people watching this deserve the real, complete picture, not just a highlight reel edited down to only the good parts. The first month, I struggled constantly, more than I let on even to Gary. I missed American conveniences I never realized I depended on until they were gone. Specific grocery store brands, the particular way American pharmacies handle prescriptions, even something as simple as the layout of a familiar hardware store. I missed my son and daughter more than words can adequately describe, especially in the quiet evenings when loneliness has a particular way of creeping back in, regardless of what part of the world you happen to be sitting in. I had a genuine scare with my blood pressure medication when I couldn't immediately find the exact American brand name at the local pharmacy, and Gary had to step in and help me find a Filipino doctor who calmly reassured me and prescribed a proven equivalent that worked just as well, at a fraction of the cost I'd been paying back home for the American version. But slowly, almost without my noticing it happening in real time, things began to shift. I started taking a daily walk along the water near my apartment each morning, something my old joints in Cleveland's brutal, ice-covered winters never would have comfortably allowed for more than a decade. I began recognizing familiar faces in my new neighborhood. The older man who sold fresh coconuts from a rickety wooden cart on the corner, the teenage boy who helped his mother run the small neighborhood laundry shop, a retired schoolteacher named Ernesto, who I gradually started having coffee with most mornings after my walk. Ernesto became one of the most important friendships of this entire new chapter of my life. He was 74 years old, a widower like me, having spent his entire career teaching English literature at a local high school before retiring. We would sit together for an hour most mornings at a small outdoor cafe, him practicing his already quite good English with me trying badly at first, then gradually less badly, to pick up basic Cebuano phrases from him in return. He introduced me, over the following weeks, to his extended family. And before long, I found myself genuinely invited to birthday celebrations, to a cousin's wedding I had absolutely no business attending as a near stranger, even to a simple, unremarkable Sunday lunch after church with people who had known me for only a few months, but somehow treated me like an old, familiar friend. I remember one specific moment, maybe 2 months into this new life, that made something click firmly into place inside me. There was a small neighborhood block party. Someone's grandchild had just graduated from school, and despite barely knowing anyone there beyond Ernesto, I was pulled enthusiastically into the celebration almost the moment I walked by. Someone handed me a full plate of food before I had even properly sat down anywhere. An older woman I'd genuinely never met before patted my arm warmly and said, in halting but sincere English, "You are not alone here." I had to excuse myself for a moment and step just outside the gathering, because I didn't want anyone to see a grown man getting visibly emotional over a single simple sentence like that. In America, in those last 2 difficult years there, I had felt like a burden slowly waiting to be managed and eventually relocated. Here, in a country I had lived in for barely 2 months at that point, a complete stranger looked directly at me and simply said, "You are not alone." I want to address something directly here, because I know a great many of you watching this are quietly doing the exact same anxious math I once did at that kitchen table. Healthcare was one of my single biggest fears going into this entire move. Back in Cleveland, even with Medicare coverage, my out-of-pocket costs for regular medications, specialist visits, and necessary dental work had become genuinely frightening in the years after Carol passed. Here in Cebu, I found a private doctor who actually spends real, unhurried time with me during every appointment, something I honestly hadn't experienced with an American doctor in over a decade, and my monthly medication costs now amount to a small fraction of what I used to pay for the exact same conditions back home. I'm not going to sit here and pretend everything about this move has been effortless or perfect, because that wouldn't be honest with you. And I promised myself, right from the very first video I ever recorded about this experience, that I would stay honest about all of it, the difficult parts included. There have been genuinely frustrating bureaucratic delays getting my retiree visa fully and properly processed. There have been days the electricity went out entirely during a tropical storm, leaving me sweating in the dark for hours. There have been quiet moments where I missed the specific particular comfort of an American grocery store aisle, the exact brand of coffee I had been loyal to for over 30 years back home. But when I honestly compare the complete picture, the overall cost of living, the quality and warmth of my new relationships, the genuine community around me, a climate that no longer punishes my aging joints every single winter the way Cleveland once did, it genuinely isn't close. My total monthly expenses here, including rent for a comfortable one-bedroom apartment with reliable air conditioning, all of my food, a helper who comes twice a week, and all of my medical costs combined, add up to less than half of what I struggled so hard just to survive on back in Cleveland. And unlike in Cleveland, I am not merely surviving month to month here. I am, for what feels like the first time in years, actually living. Which finally brings me to the specific morning I most wanted to tell you about. The morning that made me truly understand everything that had happened to me over the previous 2 years. It was my 72nd birthday. Gary had insisted on organizing something for the occasion, and despite my repeated protests that I genuinely didn't need any fuss made over me, he arranged a small gathering on a quiet stretch of beach not far from where I now live. Ernesto was there with his adult daughter. Nana from the little breakfast restaurant came along with her husband, both of them dressed slightly more formally than usual. A handful of other expat friends I had made over the previous year sat together under a simple canopy at plastic tables, and someone had strung up paper lanterns, despite it being broad daylight outside, purely for the festive look of the thing. I woke up quite early that particular morning, well before anyone else had arrived, and walked down to the water completely alone. The sun was just beginning to rise over the distant horizon, slowly turning the water a soft, warm gold color that I still don't think I could adequately describe to someone who hasn't seen it. I sat down directly in the sand, something my back would have complained about mercilessly for days back in Ohio, and I simply watched the waves roll in for a long, unhurried while. I thought about Carol, and I let myself cry a little, quietly, the way I still do sometimes even now when I think of her unexpectedly. I thought about the kitchen table I had sold to strangers, about the recliner I used to sit motionless in for hours at a stretch doing absolutely nothing, about the 3 in the morning panic over medication costs that used to keep me awake. I thought about Diane's careful, well-meaning voice suggesting assisted living, not out of any malice whatsoever, but out of a broader worldview that quietly insists. Once you're old, your only remaining job is to be managed efficiently and quietly until you're gone. And sitting there in that warm sand, 72 years old, watching an unfamiliar sunrise over unfamiliar water in a country I hadn't even known existed as a real option for me barely 2 years earlier, I understood something with a clarity I had never quite reached before in my entire life. The thing I had spent my whole life chasing, through 39 years of walking mail routes in every kind of weather, through decades of carefully saving every spare dollar I could manage, through an entire lifetime of quietly believing that enough saved money would eventually buy me some measure of peace, had never actually been about the money at all. Not really. Not underneath it all. It was about being seen. It was about genuinely mattering to the people immediately around me, not as a problem waiting to be efficiently solved, but as a person still fully capable of living, laughing, learning new things, and belonging somewhere real. America, for all of its considerable wealth and all of its carefully built systems, had somehow quietly stopped offering me that basic human necessity. And here, in a small coastal city I hadn't even heard of a few short years before, I had found it completely by accident, through an old Navy friend, and a single message that simply said, "You can still actually live." I sat there in that warm sand until Ernesto eventually came looking for me, mildly worried I had wandered off somewhere on my own. I told him I was fine, genuinely better than fine. I told him I had just been sitting there thinking about how strange it is that real peace doesn't always look the way you might expect it to beforehand. Sometimes it isn't a larger bank account after all. Sometimes it's simply rice and a fried egg at a plastic table, served by a woman who gently corrects your pronunciation with a warm smile instead of visible impatience. Sometimes it's a complete stranger at a neighborhood block party telling you, in halting English, that you are not alone. We walked back together to the small gathering under the canopy. Gary handed me a cold drink almost the moment I arrived and said, grinning, "Happy birthday, old man. How does 72 feel from where you're standing?" I looked around slowly at that small canopy full of new friends, people who had known me for barely 2 years at that point, but who genuinely seemed happy simply that I existed, that I was there among them, and I said, quite honestly, "Gary, I think this is the first birthday in a very long time where I actually feel alive." I know some people watching this will say that I abandoned my roots, that a man should stay physically close to his children and grandchildren no matter the personal cost. I understand that perspective completely, and I genuinely don't judge anyone who chooses differently, who chooses to stay close no matter what. But I would gently ask you to consider one thing. Staying physically close doesn't actually require staying quietly miserable in the process. My son and daughter and I now video call every single week, more consistently, if I'm being honest, than when I lived just a short 2-hour drive from Michael, and still barely saw him more than twice a year around our conflicting schedules. I have already flown back twice to visit since making this move, and both times, independently of each other, they each told me something that meant absolutely everything to me, that I seemed like myself again. not the shrinking, increasingly quiet man sitting motionless in a recliner. The father they remembered clearly from their own childhoods, engaged, genuinely curious about the world, fully present in the conversation instead of just going through the motions of it. Growing older with real dignity, I have come to believe, doesn't mean quietly disappearing and making yourself as small and undemanding a burden as humanly possible. It doesn't mean simply accepting whatever version of managed decline happens to be offered to you first. Whether that's a glossy assisted living brochure or a lonely, increasingly expensive house full of bills you can barely afford anymore. Real dignity, I've slowly come to understand through all of this, means having the genuine courage to honestly ask yourself whether the life currently in front of you is actually a life, or simply a slow, carefully managed ending. And then having the further courage to change course entirely if the honest answer to that question frightens you. I'm not sitting here telling you the Philippines is the singular answer for absolutely everyone watching this video. I'm not even necessarily saying that moving abroad at all is the right answer for everyone. What I am saying, as clearly and honestly as I know how, is this. Don't let anyone, including your own quiet internal fear, convince you that your personal story is already finished simply because you've reached a certain age on a calendar. I was 71 years old, grieving deeply, financially struggling, and increasingly invisible in my own life, and I still found an entire second chapter I never could have possibly imagined for myself. If that kind of change was genuinely possible for a retired mail carrier from Cleveland, Ohio, it might very well be possible for you too, wherever you happen to be watching this from right now. America gave me 39 years of steady, honorable work, a family I love without reservation, and an entire lifetime of memories I wouldn't trade away for anything in this world. But it couldn't give me this specific, quiet, sunrise kind of peace I finally found sitting alone in warm sand on my 72nd birthday. For that particular gift, I had to travel nearly 8,000 miles from everything familiar and take the single biggest risk of my entire life. And sitting here now, months later, watching the same water in front of my new home, I can tell you without a single trace of doubt remaining in my mind. It was, without question, the best decision I have ever made.